Well, we're still just saying that there's so much material in the book of Genesis that it's very hard to get out of it. We said that at the beginning. It's very hard to get beyond the book of Genesis. And in many ways, like so many of the beginnings of things, the beginning contains the seed of everything else. I've pointed out elsewhere that the first psalm is that the fathers of the church regarded the first psalm as the seed of the rest of the psalms. That it contained virtually everything that was in the whole book of Psalms, and the book of Genesis is like that. It's that's those principles. We say if you go back to the principle, if you go back to the beginning of things, you find that everything is there, and that the rest of the history of the Old Testament is the unfolding of the things that begin in the book of Genesis. The last time we talked about Cain and Abel, and we talked about the Tower of Babel, and the next great event is the next great beginning. You can say that the whole of Genesis, as the title implies, is a book of beginnings, and the next great beginning, great event, is the calling of Abraham, the beginning of the beginning of the Jewish calling, the beginning of the history of the chosen people of God.
The commentators always, and there's a biblical reference, of course, for it, but the commentators always talk about certain ages. So that is, the whole of creation can be put into a number of different ages, corresponding to the days of creation, pretty much. And it turns out to be 6 days. Just as God created everything in 6 days, then the whole history will be 6 periods, 6 great ages, 6 great days. And the first day is taken from the beginning to the flood. And then the second day is from the flood to Abraham. And then the next day is from Abraham to the end of the kingdom, to the fall of the kingdom, to the dispersion of the breaking up of Jerusalem. And then the next one is from then to Christ. That is the age of the prophets, pretty much. And that's it. That is, now we're in the last day. And we're waiting to the end of the world. And these things go in pretty large chunks of history. It's all been worked out. I know in this edition of the Douay Bible that I have, Bishop Challoner, who was the English Catholic bishop in London, I guess Westminster. I think, isn't he called the Bishop of Westminster? But anyway, he was the only Catholic bishop in England in the 18th century, the latter part of the 18th century, and he is the one who edited the Douay Bible in the form that we now have. It had been never really completely gathered together, I guess, and published until his time. We're talking about 1790, something like that, around the time of the French Revolution. And he supplied a whole set of notes to this particular edition. One of the things he does is he dates everything. As you know, down at the bottom of the page, it gives you the date of the flood, for example, or the date of the call of Abraham. We're just looking down here, chapter 12, book of Genesis. The date of the call of Abraham is 2,083 years after the creation. That is after the expulsion. I think they leave out the time in Eden, in paradise, because nobody knows that. But from the expulsion of Adam when the generations, because the only way you can tell these years is by the counting of the generations. But from the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden until the call of Abraham is 2,000 years, 2,083 years. And right next to it, it says, and that is to say, 1,921 years before Christ. So it's almost the midpoint.
Midway, yeah.
So you take a few years here and there, you're talking about 2,000 BC or 2,000 years after the expulsion. And that would mean that at the time of Christ, the world was 4,000 years old, which would mean that the world is only 6,000 years old now, which, as we know, has caused quite a lot of trouble with modern science. This is one of the big disputes that the fundamentalists have with the whole theory of evolution, because the theory of evolution talks in terms of millions and millions of years. And the Bible, if you count the number of years, and this has been done with consummate accuracy, these years have all been calculated. If you count those years, these are the numbers that you get. Well, we can leave that one in brackets. We're not going to get into a discussion about the relation of the Bible and science, but I just wanted to bring that up in terms of where we are in history. Abraham ushers in one of the great ages in history, and as you were saying, in a way, ushers in the beginning of the whole Christian dispensation, because now God actually interferes in his creation and gives a promise, and the promise is Christ. That's the promise that he gives. It says, and the Lord said to Abram, now at this time his name hasn't been changed yet. His given name, the name his father gave him, was Abram, A-B-R-A-M. And the Lord said to Abram, go forth out of thy country and from thy kindred and out of thy father's house, and come into the land which I shall show thee. And I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and magnify thy name, and thou shalt be blessed. I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee, and in thee. Now in my text this is capitalized. The way the words of consecration are in the Mass, that is, in thee shall all the kindred of the earth be blessed. And that in thee refers, of course, thy seed, that is Christ. In Christ, all the nations shall be blessed. So we're still only in chapter 12, but we're at the beginning all over again. That is, we're at the beginning now of grace, really, of the restoration of grace.
Yes, up until this point, we're largely, Genesis has been dealing with the loss of the grace. That was the subject that we dealt with last time in the story of Cain and Abel, and the Tower of Babel, and the story of Noah, the flood, are all those are signs of the fall and the loss of grace. And here now 2,000 years later is the beginning of the restoration of grace through Abraham. I think as you always should, so far as you can, think of what the New Testament says. If you read the book of Hebrews, which is a very good book to read, you can actually read it at the same time that you're reading the Old Testament. It's one of the best books to read, the letter to the Hebrews, because it reviews the whole of this history. And there he says, Abraham went out not knowing where he went out not knowing whither he was going. That's 11th chapter of Hebrews.
By faith, he that is called Abraham obeyed to go out into a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing whither he went. That's St. Paul commentating, if you will,
on the meaning of the whole thing. Abraham is the father of faith. He's the father of Israel. He's the great father, the great patriarch of Israel.
Not knowing whither he went is a perfect example of faith.
Yes.
Because if you know where you're going, you might be going for your own reasons. But if you don't know where you're going, then that's pure faith.
Yes. He went out without knowing. He was simply called and told that he should go out and take all of his family with him and all of his people with him, all of his cattle and his family, and go where God would lead him, wherever that would be. And he did that. I have a note here at the bottom of my page that I wrote in myself that says that in the Jewish and Mohammedan traditions, there are stories that Abraham was ridiculed for going out this way without knowing what he was doing. He was considered a fool to do this. Those traditions are also very often, they're very good commentaries on the scriptures. They're the same kinds of traditions in the Christian tradition of Noah being ridiculed by his wife and his neighbors for building this boat going out. Because it's foolishness. He's obeying God. He's acting on the basis of faith, which is folly in the eyes of men.
We were talking several times ago, we say weeks ago, several tapes ago. Our great ages are measured on magnetic tape.
Not even coffee spoons.
But several times ago, we were talking about general principles of how to read the book, and that it must be read on many different levels. And one of the things that occurred to me as we were bringing up this subject of Abraham and his faith is the personal level. That is, you can read this book just simply for the story, and we hope that that's always first. You just ought to know the story of Abraham, Sarah, and what happened to him, what he did, what they did, their children, especially their child, Isaac, and Abraham's other child, and know all those stories. But then you can move to the Christological level, that is, that this Old Testament is all about Christ. It has one subject from the word in principio, right at the beginning. It really has but one subject to every verb. Or maybe I ought to put that the other way around. Or maybe it has several subjects, but Christ is always the verb. Maybe that's the way to put it. He's always the active power of whatever subject it is that we're talking about. Then you can read it on a moral level frequently. That is, you can draw on it. Sometimes it's kind of quirky when you do that. Interesting food for thought. That subject will come up in a moment when we talk about the question of whether or not, for example, Abraham lied when he went into Egypt. He lied about his wife, said, "She's my sister." And the moralists will all, of course, defend Abraham and explain that you have to understand that in a way she was his sister and so forth. But those moral questions will come up, and they bear on our own lives. But then the one that I was thinking of was just this personal, or you might call it spiritual level. That is, today, right now, in the world we live in, surely Abraham can be our patron saint. That is, how many times I myself have quoted that sentence without particularly referring it to Abraham. That is, I wasn't thinking of Abraham, I was just thinking of the sentence. I don't know how many times I've said, I don't know what God wants us to do. It seems impossible to know what he wants. That is, today in the world, in the church, and as well as in the secular world, we don't know. But we do know one thing. We know that he knows. Over and over again, we have that profoundest of all consolations, that whenever we're lost and we can't see the direction of our own lives or the direction of history, we can always go back to Abraham, who went not knowing whither. That's where I think he should, we should say a little prayer to Saint Abraham, because he's certainly a saint. I think that's often forgotten too.
Yes, all of the great holy people of the Old Testament are saints, and they were honored as saints in the very earliest days of Christianity too. Even going back to Noah, you would find there were churches dedicated to Saint Noah and cults of devotion to him and to all of these great holy people of the Old Testament.
In fact, a little story comes to my mind. Several years ago, a man after Mass came up to me and said that he had heard that I had students who were in Rome, and would it be possible for me to write to one of them and see if they couldn't get a relic, St. Joseph, because he and his wife had a deep devotion to St. Joseph, and she was having terrible difficulties. They were having difficulties in having children, and they wanted children very, very badly. They were a young married couple. Would I please write, perhaps get a relic of St. Joseph, if that were possible? So I wrote a letter to a young seminarian at that time, who was now a priest in the Opus Angelorum. And he wrote back and said that at that time the offices in Rome were no longer validating relics of St. Joseph. That had been done up until recently, but some kind of a law had been passed that this would no longer be done. There was some doubt about the validity of some of these relics, apparently. And so just, in effect, he said you couldn't get them, at least you couldn't get them validated. However, he said in his letter, why don't you tell this young couple to pray to Eve? And I remember telling the young man that the next couple of months, and the look on his face was one of wonder, first of all shock, but God bless him, not disbelief. That it was real wonder. That as he looked up, he opened his eyes and he said, I never would have thought of that. And I said, well, I wouldn't have either, but this young seminarian thought of that, and he's absolutely right, of course. That is, Eve is a saint. And what a shock, and what a beautiful shock that is. And as you say, Noah and Abraham.
Even that is, some of those people aren't even, well, they're not even Jews. They're not even. Yeah. That is someone, Father D'Angelo, Cardinal D'Angelo, wrote a book called The Holy Pagans, and he was talking about people like Job. Job's a saint, or Ruth. They're not Jews even. They were not part of the chosen people at all. But
Eve wasn't a Jew.
No, Eve wasn't a Jew. He wasn't a Jew at all.
Because the Jews begin with Eve and Noah, or because the Jews begin with Abraham.
Yeah, exactly.
But it is a wonderful thing. If we can do nothing else, if you read the Bible on this personal level, I think you would call it the level of prayer. Perhaps we could put it this way: the Bible is a book of history. The Bible is a book of doctrine. We talked about those things, but it's also a book of prayer. That is, every word of the Bible is prayer. These are the Holy Ghost's words, and when we devoutly read these words, we are offering back to God one of the greatest gifts of His creation, which is exactly what we do, or what they did in the Old Testament with a sacrifice. As God, after all, gave the sheep, and then the sheep was given back to God in sacrifice. It's what we do at the Mass in giving back Christ, or Christ Himself, giving Himself as a human being, giving Himself back to the Father. So when we read the Bible, we read it as prayer. And these great patriarchs are matters of prayer, matters of meditation, subjects of meditation.
Yes, there's various spiritual writers talk about prayer as a spiritual life, as a kind of conversation with God, conversing with God, and the language of that conversation is the language of the Holy Spirit. He's given us the language, which includes not merely the words, but the persons and the events, the places. They're all the very vocabulary that we should use in prayer. That is in the very reading of the scriptures, and in the very calling to mind of the stories themselves. We're participating in the life of prayer, in the spiritual life. This is an extension, you realize, of what we had said before. At the very beginning of the course, that is that when you read a poem, you participate in the thing that is being represented. You enter into its life imaginatively, and you are able to participate in the things that are being represented.
We spoke of Telemachus, for example, remember, as being us.
Yeah.
Certainly young people who read that poem, read the Odyssey, can see that they themselves are actually living life. What a wonderful thing it is just to say, just to speak the word Abraham. I mean, that's in itself a prayer. Sarah. Those are great words, and those people were given to us by God. We ought to know them. God has gone to the whole trouble of creating those people and giving them these graces, that they would be what they were. Not only do what they were, but simply be what they were. And so far as we know them and read about them and think about them and converse about them, we are becoming like them.
Yeah, we're participating in their life. That is, as you do that on the natural order, when you read any work of any poetic work. So when you read this great spiritual work, it's analogously, that is in a far greater way, and to a far greater degree, and dealing with far greater things, you actually enter into the life of God Himself.
The Protestants particularly took up the Old Testament, I suppose, in defiance to some extent of the church, in the naming of their children. That is, the Protestant names of children are almost all out of the Old Testament. If you go back through the history of the United States, for example, to the Pilgrims and their children, you get names that surprise you: Peleg and Gomer and so on, who are relatively minor people, let alone the famous ones like Abraham or like Ruth or Judith and whatnot.
Yeah, you can go through. There's Peleg right there.
It's right there.
There's Eber and Peleg and Reu.
You'll find those names
Nahor,
in the history of New England. The Protestants use those names, but why not? Why not? I mean, we Catholics tend to think that it's necessary to pick a saint from the calendar of saints, and that's a very good thing to do. I don't mean to oppose it, but there certainly isn't anything wrong. Quite the contrary, there's something good about those Old Testament names. That is, of including them in a family of children, so that one of them might be named Mary, and another one might be named Peter, but then another one might be Gregory or Thomas or Ignatius. But then why not Abraham or Peleg?
Yeah, it sounds so almost comical. Let's say we're going to name someone Abraham O'Connor. But there's
it was Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, that's right. No, there's no real reason. That really is a prejudice. That is a prejudice. That we wouldn't do that.
But these names, well, some of them still are used. Ruth is used quite a lot.
Oh, yes. Oh,
and
one of my daughter's middle names.
Yeah. And Esther is used.
Yes.
Judith is used. Am I right in saying mostly Samuel. Although not as much. Again, Samuel's still, now among Americans anyway, that's an old-fashioned name.
Yeah. Of course, a lot of people are not conscious of those being Jewish names at all.
Yeah, right.
They become so common.
Right. That's true.
It's only certain names, like Abraham.
But when you name a child Abraham, you are conferring upon him a patron saint of no mean power and glory. Omnis glory is Deo. So maybe I shouldn't say glory, but reflected glory. Abraham is one of the greatest of the saints. In the cathedrals, the Old Testament patriarchs were always lined up with the apostles, that is, the balance there, so that anybody who was brought up in the culture of the Middle Ages would know the Old Testament as well as the New.
Well, the 12 patriarchs are simply they are the Old Testament version of the 12 apostles. There is a deep significance in these numbers and these parallels. They are to the chosen people of the Old Testament, but the apostles are to the new covenant.
We've spoken so many times about the memory, and when you begin to read the Bible on this personal level, take it into your own life and make it a matter of prayer. Of course, the next step then is to take it, in a way, to take it out of the Bible, that is, to take it into your own life, to take it into your own heart, and then it becomes a matter for an internal reflection. Even in the absence of the book, you get to know Abraham and you get to know Sarah, and you could talk about them and think about them and pray about them, even when you're not reading. We've lost that culture. There's just no question about it. It's no longer everywhere about us as it once upon a time was, both in the Catholic and in the Protestant tradition. That is, in the Protestant tradition, there was daily Bible reading in the home, and they sang songs about the stories, and the children brought up in Protestant tradition knew the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors and his bad brothers who sold him into slavery and so forth. I mean, they just knew those stories from earliest childhood. In the Catholic tradition, it was even richer. It was, as we say, it was in the stained glass windows. It was in the portals of all the doors to all the churches. Everywhere you went, there were pictures, statues and pictures, and hymns, songs, pageants, plays. We've referred, I think, haven't we, to the medieval plays of Noah and
I don't know whether we have or not.
That's popular. It was as popular as a Telly Savalas television series. People were entertained by on feast days or by even by traveling actors, but usually by the guilds that would put on these pageants on different days of the year, where these stories were acted out, and people played the part of Father Abraham. That is, a member of the Tailors Guild would become Abraham so much that he got identified with him by the local townspeople. He would act that year after year after year, and so that the whole culture was the memory of people was drenched in this rich and magnificent rain. I don't know, I'm mixing my metaphors here. A germinating rain, you might say. We've lost it. I think there's no question about it. If you ask the average person today, to name right off the top of his head his 10 favorite movie stars, I think he could do it without even thinking. But if you asked him to name 10 people, I mean, just as simple as
10 people in the entire Old Testament.
He'd have a hard time.
Yeah, well, the thing is, of course, the Bible has become a book to us, solely a book. And a book is a kind of storage place. It's like a storehouse where it contains, it's like a library or a card catalog or an encyclopedia where you have stored up knowledge. And it stays there like some sort of corpse bottled up in the book. And it's not allowed to emerge from the book at all. We have a certain way we read the story and then we close the book.
It's an archive.
Yeah, it's an archive. And we say, well, there it is. We've shut the book and then we kind of shut the thing up in there.
You can look something up in it when you have to.
If you want to know, you can go look it up. That's the thing. You don't need to know it. You don't need to remember it. And therefore, you don't really allow it to enter into your life, and you don't enter into the life of those people. It's a kind of habit. It's a habit of mind, really. Although, of course, this is encouraged by the condition of the culture that we live in, which is so hostile, really, to everything that is in this book. It's simply
you mean it's just deliberate?
Lost. Yeah, it's deliberate. Yeah, it's just completely lost. That is, you will never hear Abraham mentioned on your television. He will never appear. There will be no reference to the stories of the Old Testament in any kind of the popular reading that you do. That is, if you subscribe to magazines or if you read the daily newspaper or anything that you do. There will never be a reference to any of these things, whereas you realize that in the typical culture, really up until very recent times, you'd say within the last couple of hundred years, really, the whole culture was saturated with it, and everyone referred to these people and to these events constantly, and had them in their mind and in their hearts. When children were named after these figures, it was done with some consciousness. But I know now, we know from experience, that if you ask somebody who he's named after, that is, if you
said Samuel, he wouldn't know.
Yeah, he would say, well, I was named after my uncle, maybe, or something. You say, well, who was he named after? He would say, his uncle. But who was Samuel? He would say, and he'd say, oh,
Uncle Sam.
They've never thought of that at all. It's never occurred to them that their name has that significance at all. It's very common. That would be true of Catholics as well.
Well, especially
Protestants. Yeah, maybe even especially.
No, in fact, sad to say, but I think it's important to say that the Protestants did hold on to this tradition in a narrow way, but they held on to it after the Catholics had largely lost it. That is, at least the fundamentalist Protestant tradition that did hold on to the book, but not to give them credit now, not as an archive.
No, not at all.
Maybe as a law, as a thing to bring into a law court, as a brief, which is a narrow way to think of it. But at least they did read the book. I mean, when Melville, for example, wrote his famous novel. It's the most famous of all American novels, Moby Dick. We all remember one of the great first sentences of all books, of all novels. He begins the whole thing, "Call me Ishmael," and then all through the book, it's drenched, and especially the Old Testament.
Captain Ahab.
Not the major figures. Ahab is not somebody that everybody would remember.
Yeah. No, not at all. Or even Ishmael.
And isn't Peleg in there for that matter? Isn't there Is he writing in there? Well, no.
No, that's you're thinking of
Queequeg,
yeah.
But several. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, of course, they're all
names.
They're all taken from that Puritan New England tradition,
and that's what Melville came out of, and in a way, what he was writing too. That is, Melville was still writing for an audience that had a hold of that tradition.
Yeah. Well, I remember, you even take people who rebelled against that tradition, like say D.H. Lawrence. He was brought up in that tradition.
He hated it.
He hated it. He disliked. He rebelled against it, but he knew it, and he was even late in his life. He was still moved by those old fundamentalist hymns that he used. He said they haunted his memory. He couldn't get them out, and he wrote a rather moving article about it. It isn't read very often, but he said,
didn't he write a book called Aaron's Rod, or was that something?
Yeah, he did write.
I think he did.
Aaron's Rod. Well, his imagination was simply drenched in that. There's nothing you can do about it. Even though he rejected it, but the hymns, he said those Protestant hymns, he thought they were very bad. But on the other hand, he said you can't deny their power and the effect that they had. And they were all biblical. They were all based on the Bible, Old Testament especially.
You never know. Beyond what we call the last minute of a man's life, when the life signs seem to go, there's always a hope. God bless, hope, even of D.H. Lawrence.
Yeah.
That he began to sing one of those hymns.
Yeah, well, he said he
get him to the other side.
Well, they're in. You see, they fix themselves on the imagination, on the memory first of all. They linger in the memory, and that means that the images are still there. And you don't get rid of those. You can rebel against them all you want. You can reject them all you want. You can deny them if you want to. You can make fun of them if you want to. But they're still there, and they still have their force. And they have there's a grace attached to those names and to those people and to those events which can still have an effect.
But when there's nothing there,
there's nothing at all.
When we think about the only question that counts, after all, the final question for all of us, at that moment, what are you gonna have with you? You're going to have your memory. You're really not going to have archives. Yes, it's going to be a little late to go look things up. It's going to pretty much be what's there. And one of the most, I was going to say frightening things, but I'm afraid it's not even frightening. It's just sort of sad. One of the saddest things about the contemporary world is that there doesn't seem to be anything there. That is, in a man like D.H. Lawrence, there you have a man who was a self-conscious sinner. I mean, he deliberately became a public sinner, made himself internationally famous for advocating sin and for actually defying God and hating God. He wrote books glorifying Lucifer.
Turning really to paganism.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't pick a man, who went further. And it is very difficult for us to entertain the idea that maybe God loves him. That maybe he loves him more than he does us. I mean, we don't know. That is the force of a man like D.H. Lawrence, that negative force. You said it a minute ago. That is, you use that word, it's a force. It's like pressing down against a spring. That is, D.H. Lawrence defied God, and he pushed God and pushed God. But there's one thing about him that you have to say, God was on his mind 24 hours a day,
Yeah.
That is, he dedicated his life.
He didn't ignore God.
No,
he wasn't ignorant.
No, he wasn't. And it's possible. And to say, we can make it a matter of humility to say, who knows? Who knows? But that spring just might have pushed him all the way back. I think you'd have to say to purgatory, because he's not going to get away with what he did, that's for sure. He's going to pay the price. But it isn't necessarily so. The church has never made up an equivalent of canonization of the damned. We don't have any infallible list. of the damned.
No.
We don't know.
No, whenever I know, long ago it dawned on me. I used to get into furious arguments with people when I was young. I try to avoid that now, but I used to get into arguments with people about God. And it finally occurred to me to ask people who were, really, really furious about God. It finally occurred to me to ask them, why were you so upset? Why are you in such a rage about it? I mean, if you reject him, just reject him. But that wasn't enough. They wanted to attack him. They wanted to attack the very idea. And it was all, I always took it as a sign of something really quite good, actually.
Yeah. They could be converted.
They could be converted, whereas the people who just said, God? I've never heard of God. What do you mean God?
Who cares?
I mean, who cares? That's, I'm not interested enough to argue, certainly, about it. It's just of no concern to me. Now, those are the people who say, oh, dear, how can you reach someone like that? It's very, very difficult. And that's what you face now. You don't see that wrath of D.H. Lawrence. You don't see that at all either.
No, that tepid, that indifference. And of course, in using the word tepid, we do have to move it even a little closer to ourselves than that and say that this indifference is very frequent with ourselves. That is, we who go to Mass and who do receive the sacraments, who are practicing Catholics, who even have some semblance of a prayer life, maybe even priests, maybe even people who have made the total commitment of their lives once upon a time to God. They grow indifferent too. That is, suppose we put it this way, isn't it a kind of an embarrassment to begin to talk about the Old Testament when you're with a company of priests? Don't you always feel, gee, we better not do this because it's going to be embarrassing to him because he won't know? I mean, the priest doesn't care about the Old Testament. He doesn't read it.
No.
And is likely to be very, very ignorant about it.
Oh, yes.
As I say, to the point of embarrassment.
No, it's like a school subject. It's like algebra or something. You say, oh, yes, I had algebra once. I remember back in high school, I had a course of algebra. And that really is almost literally true of the Old Testament. That is, that it's a course that everybody took in seminary, and of course there are the readings. But
again, in most seminaries, they don't do a heck of a lot of reading of the actual book.
No.
They get a lot of stuff about the Bible and
well, it's just
scholarship.
It's like any other subject,
like algebra or like physics.
Yeah, you know all about it. You don't know the thing, you know about it. You've read books
you get
about
theories
it.
about it and so on. But actually, it is a matter of. We have to say it's very, very serious with ourselves as Catholics, and especially with priests. That this is gone too, and it may be, you see, to make the contrast again, that a really self-consciously evil man like D.H. Lawrence was more alive in his hatred, but nonetheless still alive to the tradition, than this particular. Let's go all the way and contrast him, let's say, with a Catholic priest who does his duty, and does his job, but for whom the tradition is really, as you say, a school subject. It's dead.
Yeah, it's dead. No, it's in a book. It's an archive, and
who can be converted the most easily? Because the Catholic, I know in teaching we've run up against this all the time. Catholic students, they're not the best students at all of the Bible. Frequently indifferent. Oh, I know.
I've been through that. I got all of that.
I had. Besides, I've got the sacraments. I'm a Catholic. I'm going to go to heaven. My life is all worked out. And you say, well, you ought to go back and consider our father Abraham. Think a little bit about him and about those words. St. Paul thought a lot about him. To go back to Hebrews 11, is that the chapter?
Yeah.
Where St. Paul says he is our Father in faith. That's what he is. And those, that's a wonderful sentence to take with you as a commentary on the story of Abraham. He went whithersoever, not knowing
whither he went.
Whither he went. Not knowing whither he went.
Well, that's we're not again very disposed to do that.
No, I'm afraid we think we know whither.
We know whither we think.
Quo vadis, where are you going? Oh, I'm going to heaven.
They got it all mapped out. They've got the map. They've got the map in their back pocket. They got it memorized, and they know exactly how to do it. But that's not faith at all, really.
And then, of course, there's Sarah. She's mentioned right away in this chapter 12. So Abraham went out as the Lord had commanded him. Lot went with him. Abram, he's still Abram, was 75 years old when he went forth from Haran. And that's where my footnote is. It says 2083 after the leaving of Haran. Yeah. And he took Sarah.
She's Sarai.
She's Sarai. Yeah. Still, her name hasn't been changed either. His wife. And gee, that's quite a sentence too. And he took Sarai, his wife. See, that's enough for an hour's thought, isn't it? We don't have to read this book fast, that's for sure. If you just know those two names and you think about those people, she's just absolutely marvelous. And she's a type too, isn't she? I mean, she recurs, as it were, again, in just a few minutes in this book, a few months or years. And he took I don't know for whom are we making these tapes? Primarily for seminarians. And seminarians ought to reflect very deeply on the married life which they have given up. What a wonderful thing that is to say. For a man to turn to his wife and say, I know indeed that thou art a beautiful woman. When you think about this culture that we lost, if you reflect upon the burning issue of the day, I wonder whether the battle line isn't there, right there, that is in the relation of husbands and wives, more than it is anywhere else. We talk about the great battle against communism that must be fought. And we know that there are battle lines drawn in Afghanistan and in Nicaragua and in various parts of the world. And we know that those things are important. And we know that there are political battles that are being fought. There are, in every nation, there are varieties of liberals and conservatives. But you push further and further back right into the home. The crisis in civilization today, I think, right now, is as much as anything a crisis between husbands and wives. They don't love each other. That is, we don't have a home anymore. And surely priests must think about that. I mean, in their great vocation, that call to the celibate life, the natural purpose of that call is exactly the preservation of marriage. That is to see themselves as the leaders of the married life. And these great figures of the Old Testament, these great persons of the Old Testament, are really food for thought. For married people who secondarily may also listen to this tape, I've often wondered whether marriage counselors couldn't take Abraham and Sarah, for example, as their patrons and reflect, on the sanctity and the depth and the reason. After all, why are Abraham and Sarah? Why is their marriage so important? And the answer is, well, because Christ was born from it. I mean, Christ, our Lord Himself, is of the seed of Abraham and Sarah. Wow, what a thing a marriage is. Yeah.
Yes, it's a well, right away it's a part of the whole sacred order. It's not. They are obeying still that is. It will. I guess it's later that God makes His prophecy about the generations of Abraham.
Yeah, it hasn't happened yet.
That hasn't happened yet. But that's what is. But that's
what's in mind. Yeah. I mean, he doesn't even know that that's what's behind it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
He's in the dark, and yet he does love his wife. And he says, "And when the Egyptians shall see thee, they will say, She is his wife, and they will kill me and keep thee. Say therefore, I pray thee, that thou art my sister, that I may be well used for thee, and that my soul may live for thy sake." And when Abraham was come into Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. And the princes told Pharaoh, and praised her before him, and the woman was taken into the house of Pharaoh. And they used Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen, and he asses, and men servants and maid servants, and she asses and camels. But the Lord scourged Pharaoh in the house with most grievous stripes for Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said to him, "What is this that thou hast done to me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife?" Poor Pharaoh, we think, poor Pharaoh, who didn't realize what he was getting into when he took Abraham and Sarah into his place. Well, this happens again, doesn't it? I mean, Israel goes into Egypt on 3 occasions. Now with Abraham and Sarah, and again with Joseph, and then again with Mary and Joseph, and our Lord. You see, this family of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac is really, and concretely, a prefiguration of the Holy Family of Joseph and Mary and Joseph and Christ. That's a wonderful story. This use of the holy lie. On the moral level, that comes up again and again. That's pretty tricky, isn't it? I mean, there is something wily about these Jews, and they're famous or infamous for it in their whole history. See, she really was his sister in the broad sense of the word. She was his cousin. She was the daughter of his father's brother. So she's actually a cousin.
Yeah, well, those words,
so it means
sister
like
and
brother,
brother, sister and brother, clear up into New Testament times. It's Jewish, really. It's Jewish, or I don't know, may even be generally cultural. The whole region. That is, those words of relationship are used in a very loose way.
That's Christ and his brother.
Yeah, Christ and his brethren. It's not. It isn't used in that literalistic way that we think of it at all. It's generally, they can be cousins rather than literally brothers and sisters.
So he's telling the truth, but he's telling a truth which conceals the whole truth, like that. And there is something comic about it. There's something really kind of wily about it, kind of funny. And that the Pharaoh, gets scourged for this, and it's not really his fault. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning Abram, and they led him away and his wife and all that he had. And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him. into the south. Well, this happens again finally with the story of the Jews going down into Egypt with Joseph, and how glad the Pharaoh is to get rid of him, just as this Pharaoh was, all those 500 years, whatever it is, later, or 1,000 years later. And now it's when he comes up out of Egypt that he well, we shouldn't pass over, just by way of parenthesis, this strange touch. It only happens in a sentence when Abram, he's still Abram, he hasn't been called yet, is a rich man now, having grown rich in his sojourn in Egypt. And there's a war going on in the south of what today I guess we would call Israel. And he gets involved in a war and lends the strength of his tribe to the defeat of the enemies of the local people. And this is known as the Battle of the Four Kings. And while the battle in itself isn't all that memorable, is what happens after the battle. One of the kings whom he helped brings forth bread and wine and blesses Abram. And this is in chapter 14, 18. But Melchizedek, the king of Salem, bringing forth bread and wine, for he was a priest of the Most High God, blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, who created heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, by whose protection the enemies are in thy hands. And he gave him the tithes of all. And that's all we know about Melchizedek. He's never mentioned again or before in the whole thing.
In history, he's referred to later.
Yeah.
In the Psalms and in the New Testament, he's referred to. That's the end of him. Historically, we know nothing more about him at all.
I was looking.
King of Salem.
Yeah, I was looking for a line. Oh, it's in the Psalms. There is a reference to him.
Yeah,
where David says, and nobody knew his ancestors. There's a line there. One of the facts about him that we do know is that nobody knows where he came from. And I can't remember. There is some other reference. It's either in the Psalms or it's told again. There's a reference to him, perhaps.
There's one in the New Testament. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek comes from the Psalms.
Yeah.
From the
Well, I have a note here, Hebrews 7:1. That's probably it. Again, we're back
probably
to Hebrews again. We mentioned it.
It's a very good book to read along with these books. I repeat. Yeah, that's the same one I've got, same reference.
Well, this Melchizedek was king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham divided the tithes of all, who first indeed by interpretation is king of justice, and then also king of Salem, that is king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but likened unto the Son of God, continueth the priest forever. Now consider how great this man is, to whom also Abraham, the patriarch, gave tithes out of the principal things. Wow, or consider, St. Paul says, consider how great this man is. Well, that's a mysterious paragraph in St. Paul. But of course, it's as if you go back, you see it's true That is, almost every important figure that we meet in the book of Genesis has a genealogy. That's what the word Genesis means. But Melchizedek just appears and disappears. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have one. It means that it's not given. But St. Paul picks it up and says he's like Christ himself. That is, he's from the other world. There is an intrusion here of God the Father. And you go back,
and he's also a king.
He's a king. He's a priest and a king.
Priest and a king.
So he's a figure of Christ.
And he's king of peace. He's the king of Salem. It's called. The word Salem is just a Hebrew. Well, that's the shalom. That's the shalom that people know now as just being the word for peace. He's the king of Salem, which is the same as Jerusalem. As Jerusalem is the city of God's peace. The J-E is the first name, is the name of God, and the Salem is the peace. That's the name of the city of Jerusalem. So he is thought to be the first king of, or I don't know about the first, but the king of Jerusalem, Melchizedek, as well as the first priest, the very first priest.
And he's a priest of the Most High God who created heaven and earth. Nobody else is, as there are lots of priests around, but nobody is the priest of the God who created heaven and earth.
I mean,
he's a mysterious figure.
Well, he's not a Jew either.
No,
I mean, where did he come from?
Without genealogy.
Yeah,
say St. Paul picks that up, and of course, it's in the Mass today. In every Mass that's said, Melchizedek is named because every priest is a priest after, according to the sacrifice of Melchizedek, who offered bread and wine. What a strange sacrifice that was, too, back in these days, when sacrifices would normally be sheep or goats or whatever, burnt offerings. And so, just in passing, because Melchizedek is mentioned only in passing, if you didn't know the rest of that history, you read him along here with half a dozen other names that we don't remember. But Melchizedek was one of the four kings. And St. Paul remembers him. But then it's in chapter 15, the next chapter, that God then makes this promise.
Makes the covenant, as they call it. That is the whole of the Old Testament is the Old Testament. Another word for that is covenant, an agreement, so that there you have the beginning of the whole of that intimate personal relationship that God has with His people, starting with Abraham.
Because the Jews dispute every word of this against us. What St. Paul is very careful to point out, that the crucial word in this whole promise is in the singular rather than in the plural. That is, out of Abraham's seed there will come one. That is, it's a promise of Christ. Now, the Jews have always taken it to be a promise for the whole Jewish people. That is, that the Jewish people will be the rulers of the world. And St. Paul is very careful to say that of course, is not true. And that is the sin of pride that the Jewish people did commit in failing to see that they are not the subject of the Old Testament. That Christ is the subject of the Old Testament. That is, God Himself is the subject of the Old Testament, not any people. And the Jews were chosen. We often hear that word, they are the chosen seed, or they are the chosen people. But the chosen seed is singular, and it is Christ that that is promised here through this genealogy here. And
as they are the instrument of God, the means by which He will bring Christ into the world.
But this was this may be the most terrible mistake that anybody ever makes. After all, it's made over and over again. But the mistake that the Jews make is to take themselves for God. It's the mistake, after all, that Adam and Eve made in wanting to take themselves for God, and the temptation of the devil to them, saying, "If you eat of this fruit, you will be like God." It's the temptation of Satan, of Lucifer, who wanted to be like God. And it's the temptation of the Jews, who said, "We, as a people, are the rulers of the world. We are the kings of the world." And therefore hated Christ because that was precisely the dispute. I am the king, and my kingdom is not of this world. That's the whole argument. And lest we attribute it only to the Jews, we have to say again, on a personal level, it's a mistake everybody makes every time he commits a sin. And for that matter, even in a less nice sense, in an ordinary sense, it's a mistake. It's a certain kind of sin that is in itself, that is to think that the whole thing is for us. Or, to give an example, how many times you're talking about the things of God, and you hear it said that Christianity is so important because it makes the world better. It's the argument, for example, in English literature. There's a man who's not very well known, I'm afraid, outside English literature, but he's very famous with us, a man named Matthew Arnold, a literary man, a great poet, magnificent poet, but also a philosopher, who actually said, I don't myself much believe in Christianity, but it's necessary for the common good. That is, we ought to have a church and we ought to have a Christianity because it makes the nation more orderly. That is, to subordinate the things that are God to the things that are man's. How often you hear that?
Yeah, as if Christianity is a means to an end rather than the end.
I know in the aesthetic order, people who say, "Oh yes, wouldn't it be wonderful?" Because after all the great works of art turn out to be religious. So in order to have great works of art, what we need is religion. So why don't we revive religion? But what we really want is to have beautiful works of art. What we really like to be able to do is build some great building like a great cathedral. But we know that we can't do that without God, so let's have God. Well, God isn't going to be mocked by that kind of argument. You meet it in the political order, in the aesthetic order, and in the moral order. Now, that is, those who say, well, religion makes you better. Or even we meet it in the spiritual order. That is, makes me better. It makes me a better person. The purpose of my reading the Bible is that I will become a more spiritual person. And being a more spiritual person, I'm a better person and a happier person, and just a more important person, a bigger person. That is using the Bible and using spiritual things for one's own advancement. That's a hard question.
People often go from the Eastern religions into Christianity. They try to use all of the religions this way. They say, well, that's what Buddhism does for you. It makes you into a better person. It makes you more able to be calm and to rise above the difficulties of this world. You simply practice these meditations and so forth, and then sometimes they'll turn to Christianity, and they find that Christianity does just the same thing for them. Perhaps better. They say it's better.
It cures your headaches.
Yeah, it does everything.
Christian Science has a lot of this. Well, that's what the whole thing is, isn't it? I don't know much about it, but the idea is that it cures you of all your ills, and it'll cure your social and psychological problems.
One of the most successful, religious movements of our times was the power of positive thinking.
There we go again. We talked about this before.
Gee, that's been successful. You just can't deny. I mean, it's simply an overwhelming success. That is, that if you take up Christianity, your golf game will get better. Your handicap will go down if you take up Christianity. And your bank balance will go up,
and even your spiritual balance will go up. That is, how many mansions are there up there in heaven? There are quite a few, and some of them have been sort of tabulated. Some say, well, we know that there are 9, and of course there are many subdivisions of those 9. But let's just take the first number. There are 9 hierarchies up there in heaven, and gosh, if I work hard, I get up to go from 1, 2, 3, get all the way up to 7 or 8. That is to say, to look upon the spiritual life as a kind of personal achievement. And it's a hard question. It's a very hard question. Certainly, we all want to be saints, and we want to pray for it, and we want to be so. But the first thing we're told is that if that's what we want, then in a way we ought to forget it. Because the condition of any kind of spiritual growth is humility. And humility would be just the opposite of that kind of avarice. That is going after the spiritual.
Get something out of it.
Get something out of it.
There's some ulterior motive there. It's in the secular order. It's perhaps it's seen best in again your relationship with someone you love. You say, well, it's like saying, well, I'm going to love my wife because it will make me a better person. I'm going to love my mother because it's good for me, and I will attain a higher status in the world and even in the kingdom of heaven if I love my mother. Well, it's true that people who love their mother probably do attain a higher condition in the kingdom of heaven.
But that motive isn't love.
That isn't the motive, and therefore it isn't love. It's something else. That's a byproduct, we say. That's something that comes from it, but that cannot be the motivation for it. That is a self-seeking motivation, which is the absolute reverse. It's the absolute denial of love altogether. That a lot of critics of Christianity say the kind of cracker barrel atheists, they come along and they say, well, you people are just in this for what you can get out of it. You're practicing religion. You're practicing religion. You're giving, you're helping the poor and the sick and the imprisoned so that you can get to heaven. And the fact is, unfortunately, it's a valid charge in many cases. That is that many people do conceive of it that way. That is, they're quite right. These people say that because they've seen it. They've seen that there are people who go around doing good works.
You keep a little book and say, I visited so many sick people today. I did so many prayers for the dead. I did so many works of mercy. And you add it all up and you say, boy, that's a pretty good day that I've put in, Something wrong with that.
Yeah. Well, the atheist is quite right. He says, well, if that's religion, he says, I'm not going to have anything to do with it, because it isn't. It isn't. It's false.
A lot of us build that up like a house of cards, and then you raise that question, and the whole thing collapses again. That is, maybe this is all hypocrisy. Maybe this is all false. I'm not really helping the poor. I'm helping myself and using the poor.
Yeah, they are merely an instrument for me to gain
In fact, there are
happiness.
certain poor people who get kind of famous. People come after them. I mean, people, you have to stand in line because of the poor. It becomes sort of a thing that the poor, matter of fact, they manipulate it. They get pretty shrewd about it.
Yeah.
They say, "Oh, here comes another one."
Yeah.
Get something. They laugh. They laugh. And yet, that's a hard question. It takes a lot of quiet reflection, and I suppose finally a kind of sense of humor. I mean, it certainly is true that you have to help the poor and you have to visit the sick. And there are times when you don't want to do it, and the only motive you have for doing it is that God told you to do it. That's true. That's true. So I wouldn't want to confuse it, in other words, with a kind of emotionalism either. That is, that you have to feel some kind of thing. There are many people who just simply do the job day after day after day without any particular concern about the motive one way or the other. You do it because Christ told you to do it. But that's a hard.
Well, that's doing one's duty, and we're not disparaging.
No,
not disparage. We don't mean to disparage that. No. But then there is also that kind of spiritual avarice of people who really do get themselves into the position where they are doing it.
Counting.
They're counting. They're calculating. They think that God is a great bookkeeper in the sky, who's keeping books on us.
Yeah, there has been a great quarrel over indulgences for that reason. That in a long hundreds of years period in the church, there did get to be that counting of the the days that you would get as indulgences. And the Protestants, of course, as we know, made it one of the major attacks of the Reformation against us. That we had that mechanical attitude about the next life. In the most recent legislation in the church, that certainly has been downplayed.
It's been eliminated, really. Eliminated.
Almost, yeah.
There's the equivalence of so many years, so many days.
There's partial now and plenary, and that's all.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been eliminated, not because it was wrong, but because it was abused. I think that's what we have to say. That is, it was a way of getting across a truth, but it did get to be abused, and so it's been pretty well dropped. That is, what the church certainly is trying to tell us now, anyway, is that we ought to think of prayers and good works as certainly having this effect, but that we shouldn't look at it as a kind of a calculus, as a kind of bookkeeping. To try to distinguish between the right motive, that is the zeal for doing what Christ has told us to do, on the one hand, from, on the other hand, avarice, kind of gluttony and avarice in getting something for ourselves. It's a hard line to draw, very hard.
Yes, it is. You go back to, of course, you go back to Abraham. You go back to all of the patriarchs, and they don't know. They don't know what they're going to get out of it at all.
No, they don't.
They don't know if they're going to get anything out of it at all.
In fact, they take a beating. Most of them.
Yes, they do. They do. They don't know where they're going. God makes promises to them, but how these things are to be achieved and what they are going to have to endure in order to achieve them, they have no idea at all. They simply go as they're bidden.
It says, and after he began to be 90 and 9 years old, so now we're up to 100. And after he began to be 90 and 9 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said to him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be perfect. Now there you are. That's what you're supposed to be. Walk before me and be perfect. Be therefore perfect, our Lord says, quoting those words.
Yes. As your heavenly Father is perfect.
And of course, that's what the religious life is. It's the life of perfection. That's all Christ asks of us, all God asks. There's not much, is it? He doesn't want us to be good, he wants us to be perfect.
Which does involve a kind of completeness. Not simply, we think of perfection in a negative way, largely as being lacking in faults. I think is the way we usually think of it. Instead of being complete, is what the word means.
We think of a perfect piece of paper as one that you haven't written on yet. In a way, you haven't made a mark.
No, there have been perfect men before. Noah. Noah was called perfect man. He was perfect in following the ways of God, and therefore he was chosen. In a way, he was one of the chosen people, not one of the Jews, but he was chosen by God, and he was perfect. That's the first use of that word. I have a footnote in my Bible that says perfect, see concordance. They got a concordance in the back of the Bible, and you look at that concordance, and the first example is Jonah, who was perfect, and the second one, second use of it is Genesis, this one that we're talking about, walk before me and be perfect. But you go down the list, and this is just a partial concordance, and it's all there in Deuteronomy. Be perfect in the Lord. In Deuteronomy, his way is perfect. In Samuel, that man was perfect. This is Job, who was perfect. The law of the Lord is perfect. In the Psalms, Mark, the perfect man. Behave myself in a perfect way, according to Psalms. It's all the way through the Old Testament. The references are just innumerable, and there are then the examples in the Bible. I mean, in the New Testament. But sometimes people think too that we don't need to pay very much attention to the Old Testament because it's only the prologue to the New Testament. That the Jews are a very imperfect representation of the carrying out of the law, and indeed they often are. But that's not the whole story. That is all of the principles are here, like that principle that what God asks us to be is to be perfect. If nothing else will.
To walk before Him and to be perfect. It's amazing, isn't it, that the Protestant can say in Abraham that he was called to faith, and then to go on and say, and faith alone, when that's not true. God doesn't just simply call him. God says, walk before me. I mean, not just have faith, but walk before me and be perfect. I mean, surely that is a denial of the whole doctrine of salvation by faith alone.
It's your whole way of life. That once again, that's in the first Psalm. The blessed man walks in the ways of the Lord. That phrase about walking. Adam walked. God walked in the garden with Adam together with him.
That surely does mean doing good work.
Yes. No, it's your whole way of life. It isn't just your faith, but it's everything that you do, particularly walking as a figure for what we do in this world, for the way that we follow.
In fact, we can get an idea of what that's like in the next chapter at the beginning. That is, what is it like to walk in the way of the Lord? What precisely would we do? And we get a marvelous glimpse of what that's like. And the Lord appeared to him in the vale of Mamre, as he was sitting at the door of his tent in the very heat of the day. And when he had lifted up his eyes, there appeared to him 3 men standing near him. And as soon as he saw them, he ran to meet them from the door of his tent and adored down to the ground. That is, their angels who appeared to him. Now, what was he doing? He was sitting at the door of his tent. And we can play with these words of walking, sitting there. They occur in that first Psalm too. There's no question that angels appear to those who watch and who wait for them. What we have here is an emblem of the whole religious life, prayer. When our Lord is asked when to pray, he says, pray always. And we pray at morning and at noon and at evening and at night. The office of the church is taken around the canonical hours so that every part of the day is covered by prayer. And here is just a marvelous example. We're here in the heat of the day. That is, we're not only supposed to say our morning prayers and our night prayers, but we're supposed to also say prayers in the heat of the day. That would be the noonday prayer. That would be, in the canonical hours, those would be the prayers of sext. What's called the 6th hour. That is the 6th hour from dawn. If the dawn comes up at 6 in the morning, then high noon is the 6th hour of the day. And here we find Abraham sitting at the door of his tent. That's the door to the other world. As Abraham is waiting. And we know, again, that theme is over and over and over again in the Bible. We are supposed to be vigilant. We are supposed to watch. We are supposed to wait. I know we used to meet here in Lawrence for prayers at Vespers. And there's another passage, as a matter of fact, not very far on, where Lot is sitting at the gates of the city in the evening. That's the Vespers prayer. And the angels appear to him. That is one of the things we do when we walk in the ways of the Lord. We do good works. But when we strive for perfection, we sit. That is to say, then we become men of prayer. Work and pray. Work and pray. These are the two things we must do. And it's a wonderful thing to think of people who have that patience, who are waiting right now. I mean, as we sit here in our troubled times, and we're worried, we don't know what's going to happen to the church, we don't know what's going to happen to our country, we don't know what's going to happen to the globe, that somebody, like Abraham, is sitting at the door, waiting for those angels to appear.
As we always say, what can we do? What can we do? It's our natural bent just to always think that there's something that we can do. When, in fact, very often, when things are very bad, we say, well, there isn't anything you can do. All you can do is wait. You have to be patient. You have to be passive and wait for God.
And that waiting is an expectation and a watching. That is, it's a kind of vigilance. It isn't just it isn't just a falling asleep.
No. It's an alert, readiness. Another of the words that's used about the patient is that readiness.
He was sitting at the door of his tent in the very heat of the day, and when he had lifted up his eyes, that's just so marvelous. That he's praying, and he lifts up his eyes. That again is used over and over again. And when he had lifted up his eyes, behold, there were 3 men standing near him, and he recognized them. He knew immediately who they were. Now, when the angels appear in Sodom, the men of the city don't know who they are, and they're carousing. They're not waiting. They're not watching. But Lot knows who they are, and immediately invites him into his house.
He says, it's really something. He says, he addresses him as my Lord, and said, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass me away, I pray thee, from thy servant." And then he offers to, he goes to fetch water to wash your feet and rest yourselves. He addresses them in singular as his Lord, but he knows that they are 3 that have come here. There are 3 beings there. It isn't God Himself. It's angels who have come, but and that happens all the time. There's a kind of dispute about this, as I recall.
Well, they're heralds, aren't they? I mean, it's not the way heralds, you always address. Yeah. But a herald is the spokesman for the Lord. Some people say, I believe, that God never appears to anyone except through an angel. That is, the angels are always there, even when the person addresses them as the Lord. You mean even when it says, "And the Lord God said to Adam"?
Yes.
Really, that's an angel.
Yeah. Right. That He always works through the angels.
It's certainly true again of Moses, because there the ambiguity is played upon as well. That is, the voice says, "I am the Lord thy God," but the voice that speaks from the burning bush, God speaks through a voice.
Yes.
So that would be an angelic work.
Yeah.
Gee, that whole passage is just beautiful, isn't it? You can take it out as a moral in how to treat the stranger who comes to the house.
Yes.
How gracious he is, how hospitable he is, what tremendous alacrity he has in bringing out everything, and it goes all the way down into details, the butter and the milk and the boiled meat. And when they had eaten, they said to him, "Where is Sarah, my wife?" And he answered, "Lo, she is in the tent."
Yes, and you see then when Sarah laughs after the prophecy about her bearing children, because they're both so old. And then it says, "And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child which am old?" That is the Lord again speaking through it. This is God speaking through His angels.
We learn a lot about Sarah in this passage too. She laughs. She overhears. She's listening in the inner door. She's in the inner tent, and she hears her husband talking to these 3 men. And one of them says, I suppose one of them says, "Abraham, your wife is going to bear a child," and she laughs. And the angel hears her. Of course, God knows. God hears her, and says, "Why does Sarah laugh?"
Is anything too hard for the Lord?